Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the stories in some of our favorite games and ask the tough questions to figure out what is right and what is wrong. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're continuing our relentless search for our son Shaun in the wastelands of Fallout 4. In case you missed any of the previous episodes in the Philosophy and Ethics series, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down this and other games, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. At the end of the last episode, we found ourselves walking into the office of Nick Valentine, a detective from Diamond City who might be our best hope to find Shaun. But the detective went missing himself, and according to his assistant Ellie, he's likely been either captured or killed by a gangster named Skinny Malone. Skinny's gang is holed up in an old subway station and inside the ruins of what was supposed to be Vault 114. It turns out, Vault-Tec purchased the Park Street subway station in February of 2077 and began construction on the new vault after closing the facility down and firing most of its workers. But closing down the subway facility and laying off the workers isn't even the most egregious thing Vault-Tec planned for the space. Just like Vault 111, Vault 114 houses an experiment, though this one involves a little less freezing and a little more raising of the temperature. Well, metaphorically raising the temperature. See, the future inhabitants of this vault included the wealthy and powerful from local society. They're planning to take in high-ranking members of the local and state government, local luminaries, business people, and their families. These people have been led to believe the vault is going to be some high-end, classy setup where they can live out the post-nuclear world in luxury. But that isn't exactly the truth. In reality, they'll be living in cramped quarters, sharing spaces designed for much smaller groups. This experiment, yet another example of a breach of the ethics we discussed in the first episode, is meant to see how people who are used to having their way and living in high society react to the high stress of being in such tight living arrangements. As if that wasn't enough, they've decided to get pretty extreme when it comes to the search for a vault overseer. Normally, you would probably want someone level-headed and scientifically minded when running such a delicate study. But Vault-Tec is aiming to put the person most likely to fail in charge of things. We can find a series of holotapes deeper in the vault that give us a glimpse into the kind of people they were interviewing, and ultimately hiring, for the top role in the vault. The first couple of interviews we listened to sound like people who would be a perfect fit for a vault that would need some form of leadership, especially one that is going to be full of politicians and other well-to-do types. But both were overqualified in Vault-Tec's eyes. They were looking for someone a bit more eccentric. Enter Soup Can Harry. Harry is a very over-the-top caricature of a conspiracy theorist. He's convinced the government is using his tax dollars to fund, quote, Illuminati Freemason sex parties, end quote. He sleeps wherever he pleases because those same tax dollars apparently pay for the roads and dumpsters he calls home. And he eats Abraxo, a detergent brand in the game meant for cleaning houses. Honestly, Soup Can Harry might just be the best character in the game, though he never made it into the vault and likely died in the initial blast. Setting that aside, I can only imagine how this vault would have played out had it gone even a little bit to plan. Dozens of wealthy elites would have been shoved into a tight space with someone who saw all of them as members of some wild cabal. Now, it's incredibly easy here to fall into the trap of schadenfreude, feeling like the people who would have been falling under the whims of Soup Can Harry deserved it. But we've got to take a step back and really examine this for a moment. The people being experimented on here would have been victims just as the families in Vault 111 were, and the group would have consisted of women, men, and children who weren't guilty of any crimes. Sure, some of the politicians and business leaders might have been corrupt or made some really stupid decisions, but that doesn't mean they deserve to be tortured in this way. And make no mistake, many, likely the vast majority or even maybe all, of Vault-Tec's vaults include experiments that amount to torture in one way or another. Some of the experiences are more physical, some are more mental, and some are a combination of both. But they are all things that no human being should have to go through. But the topic of the vaults in general is one that is better left to another video. We came to Vault 114 to save Nick Valentine, and that's what we're going to do. As our hero walks into the vault, in his version of the modern day, there are no conspiracy theorists or high-class elites, at least none partaking in vile experiments. Instead, we can find wave after wave of henchmen, all there to protect whatever secrets the bunker might hold. After beating them into submission, we come to an open room, with a man taunting a trapped Nick Valentine. The detective doesn't seem too broken up about being a captive, even poking at the man by suggesting he might be on his boss's kill list for being a, quote, lousy cheating card shark. We could just hang out until the man leaves on his own, rescuing Valentine when the coast is clear, but that wouldn't be nearly as fun. With a couple of rounds from our minigun, Dino is dead, and before long, Nick is freed. And this is the perfect time to talk a little bit about this group that calls Vault 114 home. It's run by a man named Skinny Malone. He's likely at least partially based on the stereotypical Mafia boss from the early to mid-20th century in the United States, bearing a striking resemblance to a man known as Al Capone. But before we talk about Capone, we need to cover a brief history of the Mafia in general to set the scene. While there is some debate about the true origins of the Mafia, the concept of mob families goes back to at least the 19th century in Italy. They began by pulling in members from groups of armies known as Mafia, who were responsible for overseeing the land holdings of landlords in the Italian countryside. They grew powerful over the 18th and 19th centuries, more or less becoming the local law in many areas. They had a strict moral code that included the idea of retribution for crimes being up to the family or individual that the crime was committed against. This code, based on something called omerta, was an obligation that people took seriously to never cooperate with outside authorities during criminal investigations. If you saw something happen and said anything about it, the Mafia would make sure that was the last thing you did, because to them, the only people who could seek justice were the victims and their families. By the early 20th century, several groups of individuals had left Italy, mainly fleeing the reign of Mussolini, and settled in places like the United States and countries in South America. Here, they would set up criminal enterprises very similar to those they'd left behind, participating in bootlegging during Prohibition, extorting small businesses for protection money, setting up racketeering activities, and getting involved in loan sharking, narcotics, and prostitution rings. One of those Mafia outfits, the Colosimo mob, based in Chicago, Illinois, would wind up becoming a home to a young upstart named Alfonso Capone. Capone was the son of immigrants, born in Brooklyn, New York in 1899. After quitting school in the 6th grade, Capone would get involved with a local street gang run by a man known as Johnny Torrio. Torrio would take a liking to Capone, and in 1920 the pair would head to Chicago, where they would join the Colosimo mob, helping to maintain the illegal liquor business during the waning days of Prohibition. Within 5 years, by 1925, Capone would be the head of the Colosimo crime family, after the death of Big Jim Colosimo and a serious injury to Torrio, who would wind up heading back to Brooklyn. Capone was seen as a ruthless leader, taking out rival gangs and strong-arming his way to more power through racketeering schemes in the Chicago suburb of Cicero. Probably one of the most famous instances of Capone's ruthlessness was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre on February 14, 1929. a group of men dressed as police officers gathered up several members of the Bugs Moran mob, a rival of Capone's group, lined them up against a garage wall, and gunned them all down. Capone was able to skirt any responsibility as he was in Florida at the time of the incident, but the circumstantial evidence points to some kind of involvement on his part. And that was kind of the way the Mafia worked. The boss wouldn't give direct orders to kill someone. They would imply that something should be done, and their minions would carry out the orders, giving plausible deniability to the guy in charge. The law would eventually catch up to Capone, though, with several attempts at charges falling flat before a conviction for tax evasion and prohibition would finally land him an 11-year sentence and ultimately end his criminal enterprise. He'd served time in a couple different penitentiaries, including the famous Alcatraz, before being released from prison in 1939. He was broken and by all accounts wasn't in his right mind for the last few years of his life, dying in his Florida home in 1947. Bringing it back around to Skinny Malone, while Al Capone may have been the inspiration for his character, the fictional crime boss is a lot less interesting as we come face to face with him after making it out of the vault with Nick. The whole reason Nick came down into the vault in the first place was to track a girl who'd gone missing, though it turns out she was a willing participant in any kidnapping that might have taken place. Her and Malone are lovers, and even with the mystery being solved, there's still one choice to make here. We can either fight Skinny Malone, killing him and what remains of his gang, or we can ease the situation with a little bravado and walk out with no further bloodshed. As fun as it is to have shootouts with the Mafia, I let him live in this situation because the goal was to get Nick out alive, and I always aim for the lowest amount of death I can manage. Skinny could have just opened up fire on us, but he chose to talk instead, showing he's at least reasonable and convincing me that letting him live is the right call. Leaving the vault and heading back to Diamond City, we get the chance to consult with Nick about finding Shaun, with our description of the kidnapper matching up pretty close with a man named Kellogg, a mercenary that's been seen in the city with a kid. He has an apartment not too far away, and after procuring the key to the place from the mayor, we're able to get inside and look for clues. A quick side note on the mayor before we get too deep into Kellogg's house. I took a moment to snoop on his console, because, of course I did. Like Piper, I tend to not trust people like Mayor McDonough. He just seems like one of those really slippery politicians, and I know there's more to him than he lets on. While reading through the logs, there was one in particular that stood out. Mainly because when we first arrived at the office, we found Piper harassing the mayor's secretary about a mysterious courier that visits the city every couple of weeks. On its own, this wouldn't be too big of a deal, but there is a note in the console about a courier sent by a man called Mr. Io. And we'll put a pin in that for the time being because it might lead us somewhere. Looking through Kellogg's house, we're able to find a secret room with a few helpful clues, like some cigars Kellogg was smoking that still have his scent on them. This isn't too helpful on its own, but when we bring in our trusty canine companion, Dogmeat, the scent trail becomes a direct line across the Commonwealth to Kellogg's location. Well, it isn't a direct line per se. It's more of a winding path that meanders through monsters and other hazards, before finally ending at a place called Fort Hagen. Getting inside the fort, we have to fight our way through a maze of scents, refusing to turn back even when Kellogg himself comes over the PA system to insist that we aren't going to find anything. When he realizes we aren't going anywhere, he finally agrees to have his synth stand down and to meet us face to face. In that discussion, we learn that Shaun is in the Institute, and that he's apparently older than we thought. Outside of that, Kellogg isn't very helpful, and in the end, we have to take him out. It isn't like he gave us much of a choice, but it would have been kind of cool to have some way to partner with him or something, as he's kind of the only one that can help us at this point. We've got no idea where the Institute is or how to get there. And with the one person that could give us an idea being gone, it seems kind of far-fetched that we'll ever be able to get in. But all hope isn't lost, as we regroup with Valentine and Piper in Piper's office to discuss what we uncovered. After a short talk, Nick suggests we meet with a woman named Dr. Amari, the owner of a place called the Memory Den in the settlement of Goodneighbor. This is apparently a high-tech place that you can go to relive the memories from your past, and there's a chance that we can access Kellogg's memories using a small chunk of his brain that we conveniently took as a souvenir. Making our way through the maze that is the streets of Boston, we find ourselves walking through the gate of Goodneighbor to be greeted by a man looking to extort us. Finn fancies himself as a sort of mobster, not unlike those we discussed earlier, and we're kind of seeing a theme emerge now. Skinny Malone was the most obvious example of mob activity, but if you think about it, Kellogg is kind of acting as a mob enforcer for the Institute, and now we're dealing with a protection racket in Goodneighbor. That behavior doesn't really go well for Finn, though, as we're soon greeted by another resident, or rather town mayor-like figure in the form of a ghoul named Hancock. His story deserves more time, but for now we'll brush past it and make our way to the objective. Dr. Amari is hesitant to help, as the only way to really dig into Kellogg's memories is to plug the part we looted from the dead Merc into Valentine, and there's no way to know the risks or outcome beforehand. Despite the possible harm that could befall him, Nick insists she perform the procedure, revealing just how awesome he really is. He's only known us for a few hours, and even though we risked our neck to save him, that act wasn't exactly altruistic, and we really couldn't blame him for turning down this task. He doesn't owe us anything, and it's kind of refreshing to see someone else in the wasteland willing to do things just to help others, with no other real motive. We showed that kind of compassion when we saved Preston and the Minutemen, and it's one of those things that helps make the world so much better. So many people only focus on what they can get out of a situation, looking for any chance to get ahead or get a reward. If more people would step up and take action just because those actions are the right thing to do, there would be less suffering all around. Thankfully, the implant works like a charm, and we soon find ourselves hooked up to a machine that's tied into Valentine's mind and Kellogg's memories. And this little ride through the life of Mr. Kellogg gives us a glimpse into who he really was and shows us firsthand why we shouldn't judge a book by its cover. To be perfectly clear, none of what we see in the memories justifies the horrific actions Kellogg takes on behalf of the Institute or anyone else. But they do give us a glimpse into who he really was and what drove him. As a matter of fact, this whole experience is a good example of how empathy works. Empathy is sometimes seen as a bad thing, like some kind of detriment. It's easy to understand that viewpoint because on the face of it, empathizing with someone who's done awful things can seem like we're somehow excusing those actions. But that isn't really the case. Empathy is all about understanding the motivation behind what an individual does or says. If we can put ourselves in their shoes, get into their mind, and figure out what makes them tick, we can make changes in our own lives and even in the world around us to help others who may be going through similar things that led the person we're empathizing with to do whatever it is that they did. Let's add some context to make it a little easier to lay out. There are places all over the world that have seen generations of war, famine, and other man-made atrocities. Each new generation goes through their own version of hell as internal and external parties all vie for power, with death and destruction being the name of the game. Focusing on an individual child, we can see how that child, knowing nothing but war, could easily grow up thinking that that is the only way. They learn to distrust anyone who offers or promises help, and by the time they reach adulthood, they've lost any hope of a better future for themselves or any family they have. They become a member of some kind of organized militia, fighting other groups and trying to take over and instill their own version of the perfect world. They even attack those who would bring food and resources to a needy populace because they see it as justified after years of hate all around them. This is a cycle that we can break using empathy to understand the cause and enact change. Applying this to Kellogg's life, we can see him growing up in the post-nuclear fallout world. His father treats him and his mother like crap, and his mother isn't exactly as present as she could be, likely because she was going through her own stuff. And they live under the thumb of the NCR and all their rules. Despite that, he manages to make a somewhat normal life for himself, with a wife and baby showing up in the next memory. His life wasn't perfect, and he was involved in some pretty bad groups along the way, but he was trying to provide a life for his family and doing what he saw as necessary to survive. And if you think about it, had the story been following Kellogg from the beginning, if we'd been playing as him instead of the sole survivor character, we would likely be rooting for him at this point instead of hating him for his role in Shaun's kidnapping and Nora's death. How many raiders have we killed to this point because we saw it as the right thing? Weren't they all just nameless enemies to us? Kellogg sees those he has to go after in the same way. The next scene drives this point home even further, as we find out one of the groups or individuals Kellogg went after wound up killing his family, sending him out for revenge. After that, something broke inside him, and he became cold and calculated in a way that he hadn't been before. He moved east, working as a mercenary along the way, until eventually reaching Boston and being recruited into the Institute, where we first meet him as he steals Shaun on their orders. Through his story, we can see how a bad environment, mixed with impossible circumstances and horrific experiences, can lead to someone who might have otherwise been a hero becoming the villain. This doesn't mean that we should feel sorry for him, or that he didn't deserve what he got in the end. It means that if we want to prevent a repeat of Kellogg, we need to focus on the things that brought him to this point. That's a rule that we can use when making decisions in the wasteland and even in real life, as we try to minimize suffering and improve the world that we live in. Finally, after reliving the events from Vault 111, we get the chance to see Kellogg with an older Shaun in his Diamond City apartment. A specialized synth called a Courser shows up to retrieve the boy and send Kellogg out on a new mission, and we learn why the Institute has been so hard to track down. They use teleportation to get in and out. So we've solved the problem of accessing Kellogg's memories, but now we have to figure out how we're supposed to get into the place Shaun is being kept. Thankfully, the last job Kellogg was given involved hunting down a scientist who apparently fled the Institute. Virgil is on the run, and supposedly hiding in the glowing sea, a desolate piece of land on the southwest corner of the city where conditions are inhospitable for just about every form of life. With Piper by our side, we head into what would be certain death for any other pair, fighting off giant scorpions and death claws as we search the radiation-heavy land for any sign of this missing scientist. We don't even know for sure that he'll be able to help, but we have to try. Surprisingly, we aren't the only humans dumb enough to make our way into the glowing sea, as we eventually stumble across a group called the Children of Adam, a religious cult that worships the power of radiation. They're truly something to behold, and we'll be talking more about them when we get to Far Harbor. For now, they're able to point us in the direction of our missing scientist, and we make our way to a nearby cave, killing one last Deathclaw before heading into the next episode in search of Virgil. Next week, we'll be using some crudely drawn plans to build a machine that delivers us straight into the arms of the Institute and provides us with answers to most of our questions. At the same time, we'll be diving into the ethics of this super secret group and trying to figure out whether they really are the last hope for humanity. To make sure you don't miss out on that and other videos in the Philosophy and Ethics in Games series, make sure you subscribe to Lost in Games on YouTube and hit the like button on this video to help it spread to every corner of the Commonwealth and beyond. For those of you who want to find out what happens next before anyone else, while getting your name on the screen and helping me to get new games for this series, I've got channel memberships and a Patreon. Both of those are linked below if you're interested. That's all I've got for this one. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.